Welcome, everyone. My name is Sal Berman. I am the University of Michigan's Chief Information Security Officer. Hopefully you're in the right Zoom room because we're here to talk about coded bias. In addition to my day job, I'm honored to be a part of the Dissonance Organizing Committee, and on behalf of that multidisciplinary group of faculty and students, I want to welcome and thank you for being a part of Dissonance, conversations at the confluence of technology, policy, privacy, security, and law. We had ethics in there. It made it really, really long, but ethics is absolutely a touch point in today's conversation as well. Tonight's event is sponsored by ITS Information Assurance, the School of Information, the Law School's Privacy, Technology, and Law Association. An extra special thanks goes to tonight's moderator, Gracie Trinidad, for organizing this session and really pulling all our panelists together and getting us in the right place where we are tonight. So I hope you all enjoyed the free screening of Coded Bias. If for some reason you missed it or want to watch it again, I believe it's available on Netflix. I found it actually even more powerful, disturbing, and revealing than I anticipated. And I'm speaking as someone that works in this space and tries to keep close tabs on it. So we'll want to know what did you think? What affected you? And I hope you're really ready to engage our panel and discuss in more depth. Join the conversation on Twitter at UMichTech. Use hashtag UMichTalks to tweet along. For Q&A tonight, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. That's the only way we're going to be taking questions, and that'll be monitored, and we'll be peppering them in along the way. And so finally, Gracie, thanks again for putting this together. On behalf of Dissonance, we're super excited to have you and our panelists here. Introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Saul. I'm really happy to be here. I'm glad that this event happened. I'm glad that the U of M supports events like these. Mom, I hope you were able to navigate the links to get here. My name is Gracie Trinidad, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Training Program in the School of Public Health. Our panelists today for this talk on coded bias include Professor Andalibi, Associate Professor in the School of Information, Professor Nicholson Price, Professor at Michigan Law School, and Professor Liu, Professor in Peter and Evelyn Fuss Chair of Electrical and Computer Engineering. We'll begin with short talks from each of these three scholars, after which we'll take audience questions. Just as Saul said, you will please submit via the Q&A feature. You will not see your own questions until they've been answered. There's awesome people working in the background to collate and select those questions and provide them to me. Professor Andalibi, take it away.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm an assistant professor at UMSI, not an associate yet. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my work around emotion recognition and emotion AI as a way for us to discuss issues of bias, but also more broadly, the individual, societal, and ethical implications of new technologies. So emotions are powerful. They mediate human experiences and their surroundings, and they also impact decision-making and attention. Online and off, emotions are often deemed private, where sharing and signaling them to others can be beneficial. For example, sharing emotions can help us maybe find solidarity and support. But it also involves privacy calculations and complex decision-making processes. Despite the deeply personal nature of emotions, AI algorithms are built to recognize, infer, and harvest emotions using data sources like social media behavior, streaming service use, voice, facial expressions, and biometrics, and body language, and so forth. In ways that are often unknown to actual users. So, and we see this technology infiltrating many different aspects of our lives, from educational settings on the right to advertising and entertainment and media, as you see on the left, or to hiring processes and driving and mental health, as we see here on this slide. And these are really just a few examples. There's really a whole lot there that we can't really talk about today. We also see critiques of this technology around bias. For example, we know that facial emotion recognition, which is a particular way of doing emotion recognition, is biased against Black people. meaning that no matter how much a Black person smiles, the algorithm is still going to associate negative emotions with them. There's also kind of critiques around that have led to recommended bans by institutes like the AI Now Institute for high-stake important decision-making processes. Again, a lot of this is largely focused on facial emotion recognition. And critiques have also included the validity and compatibility of compatibility with emotion theories of emotion recognition technologies. A key perspective that's missing in a lot of these debates around emotion recognition is that of the humans who actually produce the data that make these technologies possible to begin with, and then whose experiences are shaped by these technologies. We're going to call them data subjects for the next few minutes. My work takes a human-centered perspective to emotion AI applications in a variety of contexts, including the work context and hiring processes, as well as day-to-day contexts like social media use. In this talk, I'll spend a few minutes to talk about the social media context. But before I jumped into that, these are kind of some screenshots from the movie. And I want to say that while the movie wasn't really about emotion AI and was more about AI more broadly, what I liked was how Joy would really engage with the Brooklyn community who were really critical of the AI technology that was deployed in their building. And you see her that she goes and actually talks to them and sits to them and hears them out. And then you see at the end, it comes full circle where you see the woman who's sitting and actually watching Joy doing the congressional hearing. So I really think that we need more of that. In the movie, we also see examples of algorithms used in the criminal justice system that don't take input from actual people, and we see how harmful they can be. So again, all of this really points to the importance of engaging with actual humans and accounting for their values and perspectives in building new technologies. So the one question that I asked in this work was, what are social media users' attitudes towards emotion recognition technologies, particularly deployed on social media platforms? And what sorts of risks do they anticipate? Overall, people thought that emotions provide insights into behavior and can be manipulated to impact behavior. Emotions are intimate, personal, and vulnerable. And emotions are complex and hard to define, even for humans. And none of this is really surprising. Like, we know all of this from years of psychology research, but it's important to understand how actual people think about emotions to then be able to ground our understanding of how they think about technologies that kind of feel into these emotions or sense them or do something with them otherwise. People also imagined both individual and societal level harms associated with emotion recognition. So for example, individual risks included risk of control, manipulation, exploitation, the idea that some people are prone to harm more than others, how there might be negative impacts on emotional and mental health, identity and digital image representation over time, as in how am I going to be seen in the future if you're recognizing my emotions now, and challenges with holding algorithms responsible. So for example, this participant said, they're going to be seeing that post and they're going to be seeing that I'm feeling depressed. They're going to be feeding into that because they're going to see that I'm drawn or attracted to articles that might make me feel even more depressed. Eventually, there's this feedback loop where, oh, this is a depressed person. We're going to feed this stuff because they just seem to gobble up this information. So this example illustrates how emotion recognition enabled content delivery on social media platforms can be particularly harmful to those who experience mental health challenges. Kind of related question was, what are social media users' attitudes towards well-being related interventions based on emotion recognition on social media? We found that attitudes towards automatic emotion recognition enabled interventions are predominantly negative. These negative attitudes were largely shaped by how people compared their conceptualizations of AI to the humans that traditionally provide support, like their communities or therapists. And these comparisons were on the basis of human attributes that they doubted that AI could ever hold. So these were helpfulness and authentic care, personal and professional expertise, morality, and benevolence through shared humanity. So as an example, on the lack of helpfulness and authentic care, this participant said, people are people and an algorithm is an algorithm, right? But the algorithm is not there out of any sort of interpersonal care, even if it's been put there by a human being. I don't know if I could ever envision a world in which it was put there to genuinely help people, which is me being a real cynic, but why would they care? I don't know. So this analysis shows how these types of interventions can feel impersonal and unhelpful compared to interventions that are authentically delivered by caring, trained human beings. These comments also accompanied participants' perceptions that companies are there for profit. So that's really always the end goal. While participants had qualms about being subject to these types of interventions, we also identified 3 development and delivery qualities of the technology upon which their attitudes toward it depend. So these were accuracy. How accurate is this going to be? Contextual sensitivity, which is really about the kind of the specific context in which the type of inference happens. So people, for example, tended to be more hesitant and uncomfortable with inferences of mental illnesses, for instance, compared to inferences about some other sort of illness, maybe physical illnesses. And that they wanted positive outcomes, guaranteed positive outcomes. So overall, these findings show that automatic interventions related to well-being that are kind of enabled by emotion recognition are incompatible with aims to promote trustworthy, socially aware, and responsible AI in the current political and regulatory landscape in the US. So to wrap up, the majority of people were uncomfortable with emotion recognition technologies, and this discomfort was related to concerns over privacy, consent, agency, and both individual and societal level harm. Data about emotions and data with emotional implications, I argue, are highly sensitive and vulnerable and should be treated as such in research and practice. And technologies that feel into people's emotions should acknowledge people's complexities. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't necessarily mean building more accurate technologies to infer those complexities. Rather, these innovations must prioritize the preferences and values of the humans that they impact. So going back to a point mentioned in the movie about bias and how it's like skewed data in and then skewed data out, I think that we should not assume that inclusion in data sets is necessarily desired, especially for marginalized groups, and that technologies are biased. And the fact that technologies are biased should sometimes maybe push us to ask if they should really exist to begin with. And finally, that emotion recognition, like many other technologies, is really a socio-technical thing rather than just the technical. And so with that, I'll end here and then looking forward to the discussion later.
Thanks so much, Professor Andalibi. Professor Price, you are up.
All right, hi. Thanks so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be chatting with you. As you can see, I don't have slides, and I'm gonna try to keep it, shorter, as short as I can because, well, why not? I'm interested in hearing what my co-panelists have to say and all of your questions. So the movie is focusing, I think, a lot on algorithms of control, policing and hiring and immigration and crime and facial recognition. I work in a different area that I think is more hopeful, which is the area of using artificial intelligence in medicine to try to help improve care. But of course, there are tons of issues with bias here as well. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about what I think is the hopeful side of things, and then shift on to two different forms of bias that I see in the area, and kind of how we might think about those and link them to some of the themes that we saw in the movie, themes like homogeneity of tech developers, biases in the underlying data sets, poor performances in different population, things like that. So starting with the positive, I'm still really excited about the things that AI can do, hopefully, to transform healthcare. I think about this is the same sort of transformation. We have lots and lots of data and big complex machines chewing through stuff, only now, hopefully it's not, more arrests and fewer immigrants, but, fewer heart attacks and better care. So I think about AI having the potential to transform care in four kind of distinct ways. One of them is democratizing expertise, which is to say care that's currently only available by specialists at fancy places might be available more broadly, because AI can help bring some of that insight to other resources. It's much easier to copy a program than it is to copy an oncologist. Another is pushing frontiers, which is to say, trying to figure out ways to do things that no human could do at all before. So the sort of continuous monitoring of 100 patients looking for subtle patterns that indicates that somebody's about to crash, so you better get there fast with a team of care providers to hopefully help that patient before they crash. A third is automating drudgery. All of you have had the experience, at least I imagine, of sitting in a doctor's office while they type a ton of things into a computer and largely don't have much time to deal with you. AI has the unsexy, but hopefully transformative potential to take a lot of that drudge work out of the hands of physicians who just hate it so much, and make it more automated. And last, optimizing resources. This is an ethically sticky one, but the question of when there are scarce resources for care, who should get it? Who's most likely to help? Obviously, that's something we've been seeing a lot of in the last year. And one of the fun things that we probably won't talk about today, but that I'll mention just as an aside, is that one of the impacts of using algorithms or technology to try to do this sort of allocation is nobody sees what happens because it's all behind the scenes. And we imagine that an algorithm's doing it without discrimination, but of course it isn't. Of course there's discrimination underneath. So lots of exciting use cases for this. I've mentioned a few of them. There are some things going on and being developed at the University of Michigan right now, things like trying to predict which patients are most likely to get a deadly infection with Clostridium difficile, which is a super bug that's often rather hard to treat. That's going on, at least at a shadow level in the hospital right now, trying to identify potential patients. AI used to interpret pathology slides so that in the middle of brain surgery, you can figure out if tissue is problematic without having to send it down to the pathology lab and wait 20 minutes for a human to look at it. But of course, I wouldn't be here talking about bias without talking about bias. So let me talk about two different forms of bias that I think are important in this space that I think about. One of them is about bias in the underlying real world. One of them is more about contextual bias, a question of translation that particularly shows up in that democratizing expertise thing I talked about. I'll talk about the second one first. And the basic idea here is, well, it turns out lots of exciting things are being developed at the University of Michigan and at Harvard and at Stanford and at Cornell Weill and at Mount Sinai. These aren't the places where most people get care. And it turns out that there is a huge amount of research on AI and lots of the data that are used to train data for health AI come from a relatively small number of places, and they tend to be particularly high resource academic medical centers or other fancy hospitals. So there's a wonderful study by Amit Koshal et al. That came out last year that showed that of all of the health AI papers that were published that said anything about where the data came from, 60% of those papers used patient data from only 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and California. Most of them use data from big, fancy academic medical centers. Of course, there are lots of reasons for this, right? These places have the resources. They have the resources to deal with the technical and the legal hurdles, and branding is a big thing. Lots of reasons you would think, hey, these are great places to get data about care. Hey, especially if we're looking for great care. But machines learn what they're shown. And so if we train algorithms on care at fancy medical centers, we should expect that those algorithms learn about care at fancy medical centers, which again are not where most people get care. These fancy medical centers tend to treat different patient populations for different ailments in different ways, often using costly interventions, the more costly than most people can afford or most places have the resources to implement. And if that's what the algorithm learns, then that dream of democratizing expertise and saying, hey, we're going to take the expertise from this sort of place and make it widely available is fraught with a lot of real potential problem if it turns out that it's just trained on a population that isn't at all similar to the patients that the algorithm ends up working on, or that it recommends care that we don't have the capacity to do. Let me give you a really quick example. Imagine a choice between giving a patient, you have a chemotherapy patient, a cancer patient who needs chemotherapy, 2 different options. One of them is particularly powerful. It's likely to get rid of most likely to get rid of the cancer, but it has some nasty potential side effects. If you have them, you've got to intervene pretty much immediately. The other one, a little bit less powerful, a little bit less likely to deal with the cancer, but has many fewer side effects. Now, if you've got a 24-hour crack team of oncology nurses and caregivers on staff, go with drug A. You can deal with the side effects. If you don't have that, if you're going to treat the patient and they're going to drive 50 miles away and not going to have easy access to care, that's a bad choice. If we just train AI in the places that have those teams, that's going to be a problem when we try to do them more widespread. The other type of bias, and I recognize I said I'd be short, and then it turns out I wasn't, is bias in the real world. So the first type of bias is one about translation, saying, hey, if we take this sort of care, we're going to have a problem translating the learnings of machine learning and artificial intelligence to other contexts. The second type of bias is even if we do that translational task perfectly, there's a ton of underlying bias in the care process. And again, machines learn what they're taught. There's a wonderful paper, again, and this is 2019 by Ziad Obermeyer and his team, where they looked at an algorithm that's being used across the country by a big health insurer to predict which patients would have a high risk of complications so that they could intervene and try to deal with those patients earlier. So what are the riskiest patients? They thought, well, what's the easy way to figure out what are really likely to be complicated patients? We need a proxy because medical complexity is hard. Let's use the proxy of money. So we'll just look at which patients had the most money spent on their care, and we'll say those are the riskiest patients. So what are the factors that mean you're going to spend a lot of money on their care? Turns out in this country, we don't do a great job spending money to care for Black folks. And so wouldn't you know it, this algorithm was being used across the country to deal with the care for tens or hundreds of millions of patients, put African-American patients into substantially lower risk categories, even when they had all of the same factors, because it was very likely they would be undercared for. We see this pattern again in medicine. Women's heart attacks are misdiagnosed because they don't have the same symptoms. African-American children tend to get lower doses of pain medications for exactly the same presentation. This bias isn't something that's easily dealt with by just thinking about translation, but it's something that you have to take into account when you're designing these things, because there's existing bias in the world and it's very easy for the algorithms to replicate it. So I hope you can see some of the themes that are showing up in the movie here. Algorithms replicating bias that exists in the world, the challenge of homogeneous developers where they're all in the same environment and they don't see the issues that show up when you're in different environments or dealing with different people. Of course, solutions are tough, but luckily I'm out of time, so I don't have to talk about how we don't have easy ones. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Professor Price, for a both enlightening and terrifying talk. Professor Liu, please take the stage. And this is our final panel for this, our talk for this afternoon.
And I will also promise to be short. Let's see if I can do it. So quick word on my background. So my background is on sequential decision theory, game theory, and optimization. And so my kind of entry into the space, bias in algorithms, has been on bias in intervention. So in the machine learning community, people have come up with various ways to mitigate bias, right? You can try to pre-process the data a little better, but more often they try to impose certain equality constraints when they reach the algorithmic decision, right? So in a typical example in mortgage loan approval is to say, we want to make sure the loan approval rate across different demographic groups is held equal, right? And our research has focused on understanding the interplay between the decision, the algorithmic decision on one hand, and the user on the other hand, who are being subject to these decisions. Now, there is an interplay because the users take the decision, they're going to act on the decision. And that's going to change the future data that we are going to collect to train future versions of the algorithm, which generates the future versions of the decision. And so what has been observed in this space is that when you issue loans, more loans than their credits would warrant, just because you want to equalize the approval rates across different demographic groups, what you end up doing is you are putting more individuals at higher risk of loan default. And guess what happens when they default on a loan? Their credit goes down even further. So even though the intention started out being, we want to make approval rates equal because we think that's the fair thing to do, what you really end up doing is you are pushing one demographic group's credit distribution even worse than they were. And so this is the type of unintended consequences that we're now seeing over and over again in this type of bias mitigation. And so to add to the conversation, it's not just that we have a problem with bias, mitigation, coming up with mitigation is far from trivial, and it's hard to do. And the approach we've been taking is to look at this over repeated interactions and try to understand what are the long-term consequences of these fairness criteria or mitigation. And the general takeaway is that sometimes they help, but more often than not, they don't. And that's because the underlying user dynamics is very complex. Okay, we don't always know how algorithmic decisions are going to drive people to behave in various ways. And so, and the other takeaway I would say is that we should not rely on or think that technology alone is going to solve this problem. And I think that came across quite clearly from the movie. The ultimate solution has to have a very significant, I would say, part in regulation, in policy, but in other types of social and community support. Going back to the loan example, it's not that issuing more loan approval is a bad thing to begin with. What happens is you cannot stop there. You can just say, oh, I gave you loan approval, I'm done, I did a good thing for society. The minute you issue a loan, you really should place other support systems in place. In the event a borrower is going to default, or a borrower lost their job, do you have system in place to mitigate that, to minimize their risk, right? You do that before they have to be foreclosed. So it's that type of social system that should be placed to go in hand with this type of algorithmic mitigation, right? So that's another takeaway. Let me end this by a few things that really stood out to me in watching this movie. One is, one of the characters said, machine learning is about using historical information to make predictions of the future. Data embeds the past and oftentimes the dark past. And so, you know, but I think the detrimental thing is algorithm is allowing us to stop thinking about the bias in humans. So I came away with thinking, why do we have this blind faith in algorithm? Is part of the mitigation not lying in stepping away and knowing that algorithm is nothing but a piece of software at the end of the day? And who here has not come across sloppy, lousy software? We've lost money on software. You know, software had led to messed up health record, and God forbid, they've led to suicide. Why are we thinking holding AI to now a different look upon AI as something that's different? It is, Professor Andalibi mentioned accountability. I would say the accountability starts with holding software to accountable. I think even that is long overdue. You know, who is paying the social cost of bugs in software? And the other thing is, going back to some of the things that Professor Price said, is there are clearly limits in how good and how much AI can do ultimately, right? I think it's very helpful to recognize what is machine good at. Yes, they're very good at monitoring hundreds of thousands of patients all at once, but they are not very good if you want to sit an individual down and talk about their family history and so on. I think having some boundaries and understanding and agreement around what is the rightful place for machine versus rightful place for human, so that I actually like the idea of IA better than AI. IA is intelligent assistance rather than artificial intelligence, so that machines can help human be better humans. I, for one, and I'm going to end this with the ultimate question, I, for one, actually don't understand why the goal is to replace humans, which is often what I see in AI literature, is the goal is to have AI be as good and better than humans. I don't know why that should be the goal and why that should be the goal in everything we do. With that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for all of your panel discussions. One theme that ran through all of these discussions today was a flattening of complexity that occurs with an algorithm, when an algorithm is imposed on any system. Professor Andalibi spoke about emotion recognition, its flawed applications, and also the receptiveness of the public to emotion recognition, that people aren't very enthusiastic about it because of this feeling of alienation that can occur when you know that a machine is reading your emotions and thoughts as opposed to a human. Professor Price shared with us the limits of academic medicine or academic medical research and its limited application to other settings, rural, community-based healthcare settings, community hospitals, and how we can't apply those same systems to the same context. It's not going to fit. And there's also a resource context in which these systems are working within that limits the application of the algorithm even further. And then Professor Liu took us even deeper into this complexity flattening and shared with us this like downstream effect, these harmful downstream effects that can occur when you think you're promoting an algorithm in pursuit of fairness or to level the playing field, and you don't realize that there are other issues that underlie these systemic societal inequalities. And so one question that I have about the flattening of complexity is kind of going back to our conversation earlier and before this panel, is what is intelligence in these contexts? Like we ascribe the word intelligence to these systems, but they're limited. They can't take us as far as we need to go. So what is it that we should be in pursuit of, other than like what is the in between that can meet us, that where you know, societal complexity can also meet machine learning, flattening, simplification? Is there a middle ground that instead we should be seeking instead of these disparate objectives?
I have to jump in. I don't know. I don't think I have a definition for, you know, what is intelligence. I'll just say I was very amused in the movie when they mentioned the earliest definition of intelligence is simply the ability to play chess. Now, I think at this point, some of the conclusions we have drawn is that basically in terms of what machines are good at, okay, I think machines are very good at rule-based activities. When you have clear set of rules, boundaries, clearly defined rewards, punishment, those are things that they are very good at. And I think that has contributed to them basically replacing and automating some of the work that we do. The other thing I think they are very good at is as an initial filter in terms of doing things at scale, but not as the ultimate arbiter, right? So that just in terms of going through billions and billions of data points as a filtering process, I think that can be very helpful. And that also relates to, I would say, scientific discovery, right? You don't know what you're looking for. There's just ton and ton of data. I will say there are many areas machines are just not very good at. And this goes back to my wondering of, you know, is there a limit? Is it possible to actually understand the limit before we continue to push for it? Things like understanding emotion, things like reading between the lines, you know, things like hearing the unspoken word. I don't think we started out recognizing those as the height of our intelligence. At this point, we're getting more and more evidence that there are some things we do so naturally as humans. It's incredibly challenging for machines to do.
So I'm torn in this space because my question is always compared to what, and I think I'm veering entirely off from how do we define intelligence to the kind of second part of yours. What's a middle ground? Where can machines be? When can we trust them? That sort of thing. When are they, or as Professor Liu mentioned, when are they better? What can they do? What can't they do? And I find myself constantly asking, compared to what? If you say, here is an algorithm that's going to be worse at diagnosing cancer than the oncologist who works at the University of Michigan and is awesome, I totally buy it. If you tell me here is a chatbot that's going to provide therapy, and you say, man, that chatbot is way worse than my therapist, I totally buy it. But there aren't that many oncologists, and there aren't that many therapists. And if we're saying kind of what role are humans playing, what role are machines playing, and what's the comparator, it's not obvious to me that the right comparison is always between excellent human practitioners of something, because there aren't always excellent human practitioners around. And that's something that I think is a bias that's very easy for us to get sucked into as people who are, you know, working at a place full of tons of awesome, really smart people who do things at a very high level. Now, of course, again, like I'm in a space where I think, hey, great, if we could have lots more people doing oncology or dermatology or whatever, and if AI can substitute for them at some level when they're not otherwise available, that sounds great to me. But if you flip it around and say, man, these algorithms aren't quite as good as a cop, but we can have 17 million instantiations of algorithms in every city where we would normally only have 20 cops, like that feels like a different trade-off that's maybe not so sanguine. So my essential question here is always compared to what, and what does that mean when we're trying to think, how do these algorithms fit into what Professor Andalibi very much pointed out are always socio-technical systems, not merely technical issues.
One thing I would add to that conversation in response to your question, Grace, about what should we be going for, like what is the what should we try to do, right? I think for me that should be driven by I would say like human rights frameworks or social justice, different ways that we can like really think about the welfare of the society and kind of where algorithms would fit, and consider again like actual humans in that all of the processes, because what we might think as academics or as like people creating technologies in industry as things that would kind of support the welfare of people aren't necessarily things that would support the welfare of the people. So I think kind of recognizing that these, and I would say centering those who would be most prone to harm as a result of any sort of algorithmic whatever is really key. Yeah, so that's what I would say.
I have an audience question for you, Professor Andalibi. And also I'm going to tack on one of my own questions at the end. So the audience question is, how do you see reducing known algorithmic diagnoses or care? This is also for you, Professor Price. Algorithmic diagnoses and care errors, especially in populations not represented by studies, the underrepresented, non-binary persons and blended races. And what I want to tack on to that question is, how can we better engage the public without risking exploitation of these vulnerable people because of the algorithmic systems that are put in place?
Yeah, I think these are open questions. I'm just going to offer some thoughts with I'm not so sure about the diagnosis, maybe Dr. Price could comment on that, but as far as kind of errors in, let's say, detecting mental health conditions or predicting mental health conditions, I think the one important point there is, right, there's one way we could go about it, which is to include more and more people and more diverse people and create more and more diverse data sets to train all of these on, and then, you know, right, and that's the approach that like a lot of people are taking who are trying to reduce bias. But the important thing then is kind of recognizing the agency that people have and that should be supported. And so if you, let's say, develop something that is using institutionalized mental health patients' data, and usually we know that there is a lot of also racial disparities in who gets institutionalized for mental health conditions. So of course, if you're developing that with people who are in a hospital and using their data, there's probably questions around the level of consent and agency in kind of providing that data, and then to be subjected to whatever the algorithm decides about you. So I think those are, I don't have the solution, but I think these are important things to consider. And yeah, just gonna stop there.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I haven't been on Zoom in hours, and therefore I had to have an unmute malfunction. So I agree with Professor Andalibi that the most kind of straightforward way to deal with this and to try to deal with it is to think about having more representative data sets, basically, and to just have broader data sets with lots more people involved. a couple of challenges with this. One of them is that more representative data sets may end up just reflecting the biases in care as they exist now, right? The example that I talked about risk predictions for Black patients, you've got a bunch of Black patients in that data set. The result is going to be you're going to predict lower risk for lots of those patients because the underlying care is biased. So that's not going to be enough. Certainly. The second challenge here, and again, this is something that Professor Andalibi mentioned, is the question of consent and participation. So there are different studies have shown in the past different hypothetical consent rates for research participation for patients of different races and different socioeconomic statuses. This is entirely unsurprising given the history of systemic racism in the American medical system, right? It is not surprising that patients of color would be less interested in participating in research studies or in having their data used for secondary research. It's an issue not of lack of trust, but of lack of trustworthiness, that the institutions that are trying to collect the data need to do a better job of demonstrating that they are worthy of that sort of trust for building data sets, for participating in research. And part of that needs to be, and this is part of the goal of a learning health system in general, the idea that, as things are learned, they turn around and make care better. And if we have biased care that continues, well, that's not a great background for saying, trust us with your data, we'll do more things with it. One thing that's nice, and I'll end this on a tiny note of hope, is that we seem to be moving in the right direction. And one of the places that seems to be moving in the right direction is the All of Us cohort, where this is a federal effort to say, we want really big, diverse, well-represented data sets in terms of race, gender, socioeconomic status as much as we can. And there's a huge amount of outreach effort with this initiative, trying to convince patients this is worth it. This is going to help get things better. And they had a decent amount of success. So far, their enrollments for patients who have been consenting to let their data be used to try to reduce bias in the future have been quite diverse. So it's a really tough challenge, but I think one that we're finally starting to make strides towards.
There was another question about the risks of AI getting it wrong when it comes to healthcare cases. So that's for you, Professor Price.
Sure. So there are lots of risks of AI getting it wrong. Part of it is the easiest risk is if you're relying on AI to monitor people, and therefore you think, hey, I'm not going to worry about checking this patient for the potential of acute kidney injury every hour with a nurse because the AI is going to tell me and monitor the symptoms, and it doesn't. And well, they get an acute kidney injury, and it turns out that's really bad. Or they get sepsis because they weren't checking for sepsis. If you rely on this as like an overall triage or monitoring solution, there can be lots of health risks. We can, on a kind of longer, more systemic level, one potential is the risk of skill fade. If doctors trust the AI too much and they eventually become complacent and lose their own ability to do things. Professor Liu before the chat was mentioning, it's tougher to remember phone numbers now that your phone does it for you. And well, it's probably tougher to remember diagnoses if the AI is going to tell you what you should be remembering. So the risk of individual harm, the risk of physician de-skilling, also the risk of higher cost interventions, the thing that I mentioned about AI being trained in high resource settings and therefore being biased towards the kind of interventions you see in fancy hospitals. Those tend to be pretty pricey interventions. If we see AI recommending those same interventions across the country, if they're worth it or not, we should expect to see healthcare prices go up, not down. And you might hope that AI would reduce costs. It might in fact do the opposite. So a couple totally different forms of risk there, but I think that kind of canvasses the playing field.
And for our final question today, this is a question specifically for Dr. Liu, who wrote a paper on data trading with competitive social platforms. I really love this paper. In this paper, you showed that there is incentive to create leaky kind of data sharing sets because the providers of that data set will protect that data more closely. So the related question for this for the entire panel is how might AI be regulated to reduce bias, or how might AI used by corporations, how might those corporations be incentivized to reduce bias or to protect data privacy? Like, are there incentive structures and regulatory structures that you would like to see in place to improve this for us, the public as a whole?
I'm happy to go first. I don't know I have a good answer. I will frame this more narrowly in the context of privacy, perhaps, but you can replace that with bias, right? I think one thing, two things come to mind. One is I think we need a holistic understanding of, I would say, what privacy actually means. So the reason I say this is a lot of our data is so correlated. If you look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, what it discovered was I don't have to disclose anything. I can be a very private person, but you and I are friends, and the only thing they know, and you disclosed a number of things about the movies you like to watch, the handbag you're using, if concert that you attended, and essentially they can tell a whole lot about me, right? So the old saying, birds of a feather flock together, this is essentially the inverse of that. That says, if you two flock together, then we know, we can infer that you're of a feather, right? And so when you're faced with this situation, you really have to ask, what is now my privacy? This consent really becomes irrelevant. I haven't agreed to give up anything, and as a matter of fact, I haven't. And yet, algorithmic tools actually does not, the fact that we are so actually predictable, right? The statistics is so powerful that in effect, I am now known. And so that's one side. So I think there are a lot of research actually needs to go into, because I don't think this is captured by current definitions, for instance, differential privacy and whatnot. How do we capture this? And the second thing is, what really is the social cost of violation, privacy violation or bias? I don't think we have a good understanding. I mean, proper quantitative studies beyond these harmful instances we have, right? Can we put a dollar amount on it? And the reason I say this is because I see two kind of remote examples, if you like. One is in the case of tobacco industry, right? It was a battle that fought over decades to actually put an amount of damage, a dollar amount on it, and maybe a better example is carbon emission. Decades of research have now gone into it, so there now are very good estimates. The one I could find was something like $50 per metric ton of CO2 generated from economic activity. That is the amount of harm. And when I say harm, I mean social cost, right? Because CO2 emitted is impacting all of us through climate change, through health, economy, and so on. It's this externality that's not well understood. I know if my identity is stolen, I have to pay to clean it up and this and that. But there's all kinds of ripple effects. And plenty of us, I would say, don't actually feel, oh, if Amazon knows the brand of toothpaste I'm using, well, what's the harm in that, right? I think it's, we really don't, I don't think we have a good handle on what really is the social cost. And if there is no social cost, then why are we worried about it, right? But if there is, what are we talking about? So I think those are two areas that I would like to see more, research and progress.
I agree so much with that. I'm honestly not sure exactly where I come down on what the privacy harms are, but I think you're right that if they're big, why aren't we talking about it? And if they're not, why are we talking about it? I'll try to add a little bit of orthogonal complexity in answering Grace's question, which is to say kind of, I think the question of how do we regulate it and how do we try to create incentives for companies to avoid bias has to be related to transparency, which is not the opposite of privacy, but there's some tension there in terms of what the algorithms do, what they perform, what they suggest, what they do for different people. If we want to know whether or not there is bias there, it is awfully hard to find that if everything is locked behind a wall of trade secrecy and actual secrecy. And that's the way most algorithms function now, from the things that Facebook and Amazon are doing to the algorithms that recommend sentencing for people convicted of crimes. That secrecy makes it incredibly difficult to know when there's bias there, makes it really hard to regulate it, makes it really hard for the public to know what's going on, makes it really tough to create incentives for companies to avoid bias on their own. The study that I mentioned about the risk predictions was an intense effort of reverse engineering. Those data were very, very secret. So I think transparency is going to be a key step towards trying to create the right incentives and regulation here.
I can add one little thing really quick, just to make it more complicated. I think kind of like issues of transparency are often, especially when coming from the industry, they tend to be very kind of not real transparency. So they're like, oh, here, we're doing this, and it's nobody knows what that means. They don't even know what they're doing. So that can be a real problem. So kind of like this, so yes to real transparency, but how does that happen? We don't know. And I would say moving forward, I think one really promising approach that I'm really excited about is collective action and kind of like different forms of resistance to make companies respond, to kind of make them responsible or hold them more accountable than they currently are. So that's one way to go forward.
And with that, it's at the hour, and I know we could talk for multiple hours more. I so much appreciate this. I really appreciate you attending this talk. The audience, I appreciate you being here. Thank you for listening. Saul, did you have anything that you wanted to share or say with this crew?
Nothing but thanks. I tried to not chat at you all during the panel, but this was amazing. This was one of the best dissonance events I think we've had. Again, this is a hugely timely discussion, and I think we just scratched the surface. So all of you may be on the hook for a repeat in the not too distant future. Hopefully we could have some, cookies and coffee, perhaps, because we'll be able to do some of this in person. But thank you. And thanks to the School of Information and our colleagues in ITS, Joel and others for putting this together, and the Law Students Privacy Technology Law Association for sponsoring the movies. Look for more dissonance events in the future. We'll be getting the recording up on the Safe Computing website in the fairly near term. But have a great evening, everybody. I know that we're all zoomed out, but this actually was a Zoom that gave me energy, and that's also a welcome relief. So thank you. Have a great evening, and come back for more. We'll be having more.
Thank you. Bye.